I'm really excited about our next guest. My mother, Sue Giles, was active with the Grayson County Attorney's Office for over 22 years, working in the criminal justice field with sheriff's departments, the Grayson County, Denison, Sherman police departments, helping to fight crime, put people behind bars with the Grayson County attorney that were victims of crime, and the criminals behind bars, and so I have always had an affinity to law enforcement in our country. So I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Alex Del Carmen to our show. Del Carmen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
You are it's incredible reading your bio. I want to give our listeners just a few bullet points about who you are, and we're going to have some candid conversations today that will go into the topics. But you have received your PhD in criminology from the College of Criminology at Florida State University. You are considered an authority on the topic of race and crime, with particular emphasis on racial profiling in law enforcement. You're the author of the nationally recognized book, Racial Profiling in America. You have written several articles and have been internationally recognized in journals, published in several books, and presented your findings throughout the world, as well as trained thousands of our police officers, including the Texas police chiefs. And you're also responsible for creating the Texas Racial Profiling Statistical Template, which is widely used by law enforcement agencies throughout the state. It's great that our mutual friend Jeff Crilly, when he introduced us, because I recognized your face. You have been a frequent guest on CNN, Fox News, as well as NBC, Telemundo, Univision, and others. You are the professor and executive director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University. And you also serve as the federal monitor for the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana, and appointed by a federal judge to be part of the monitoring team in Puerto Rico, where you're currently overseeing internal affairs use of force. So what a great bio, and we are so blessed to have you living here in our Dallas-Fort Worth community.
Thanks for having me, and I'm honored to be on your show.
Well, we're honored to have you. And I know, one of the subjects that we're going to talk about, there's been so much going on with the bad publicity that's given to police departments across our country. What are some of the people say that and they go, oh gosh, maybe as a teenager, or I'm in college, my nephew wanted to be a police officer and he's changed his mind. What are some of the police recruitment challenges that you're seeing right now because of that publicity across the country?
Yeah, so we've had, that's a great question, by the way. As you know, in the past maybe 7 years, we've seen a rise of just really negative publicity towards police officers and police agencies across the United States. And we're beginning to see, as some experts call it, the Ferguson effect, in the context that a lot of recruits across the United States are really having a hard time trying to either justify to their families that they want to be police officers, or really justifying to themselves as to why it is that they should join the ranks of law enforcement. If you really think about it, law enforcement historically in the United States has been a very tough profession to get into. I mean, you look at how we began in the U.S. in the era of the immigrant era in the U.S. 200 plus years ago in Boston and New York, where many of our young Irish individuals that came in through our immigration ports, they joined the police force because they felt that this was a way to empower themselves and to empower their own minority groups. And so it's been always a very tough profession to follow. But now, you have a growing skepticism across the United States that police officers are bad, that the pay is lousy, that the hours are just simply cruel when it comes to a marriage or to a family. And so what we see across the U.S. is just, an incredible challenge for anyone associated with the law enforcement profession to be able to justify as to why it is that a person, a young individual today, 21 years old in the state of Texas, would ever join the ranks of law enforcement.
Absolutely. And what do you think, just in terms of what departments will have to do to get creative? I mean, how do you think that they can overcome this now into the future? Because you look 10, 15 years down the road, I mean, we're going to have a crisis in this country, if even that long, because of this situation.
Yeah, I was going to say, we don't have to wait 15 years.
Oh, yeah, probably a couple years, if not now.
Exactly. And so I think what, and when you say creative, law enforcement across the U.S. is already being creative. Like, one of the things that they're doing is they're using social media extensively to be able to recruit people. They're using bonuses, sign-up bonuses that, individuals get over a course of time once they sign up in the ranks of law enforcement. They also are giving credit, college credit, to some of the police academies so that people can see that as a continuance of their education. Their salaries are becoming more competitive now. We have cities like Plano and others here in the Metroplex that are paying a significant amount of money to police recruits going through the academy. So what we see across the board is that law enforcement has really come together and realized that unless they are creative,
they're not going to have anybody.
Exactly. They're not going to have anybody.
You brought up something I think that's interesting. I've worked with the Dallas Police Department on their national NAMI walk for the Association of the Mentally Ill, as well as the Brain Injury Association of Dallas. And one of the things is I've gotten to know some of these police officers, the challenge, particularly with Dallas had in particular, is that the other suburban areas were paying a lot more. So a lot of the Dallas PD were leaving to go to Plano and Frisco and Allen. I hope that Dallas has kind of realized that disparity, because that's hurting the city of Dallas.
Absolutely. And Dallas is not alone in the context of salary compression, right? So you see other smaller cities that are just simply not able to compete with the bigger cities or the wealthier cities in the state of Texas, right? So what happens is that young millennials are looking at the disparity, sometimes $20,000, $30,000 with startup pay. And why would you want to go and work for a law enforcement agency that pays you $20,000 less than perhaps a bigger police department where the ascension in rank is going to be quicker, where perhaps you're going to be able to move a lot faster and gain more experience in the first few years? And so these even cities like Dallas that have salary compression, they're going to have a really hard time recruiting people 3-4 years down the road. They already have challenges, but they will have bigger challenges.
Right. And before we go to break, I think the other thing is realizing that some of these police officers are working 2 or 3 jobs just to feed their families in some of these lower paying areas. And that, that's not good for the community, knowing that, they're exhausted because they're, not able to really give 100% of their time, just knowing that they just got in at 2 o'clock in the morning and they have to report to work at 7 in the morning for their second or third job. So if you're just tuning in, we are on the phone with really, I'm so excited to have Dr. Alex Del Carmen on the show, who is the expert in criminology and also the professor and executive director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State. We're going to come back and talk more about our police officers and some of the a new law we have in Texas you may not know about. We'll be right back. Dr. Del Carmen, we were talking before the break about how can we, how police organizations and departments across the country are having to get creative in terms of recruitment challenges. You shared, I know when we were talking about prior to doing the show, there's a new law called the Sandra Bland Act, and I had never heard of it. So I'd love for you to kind of educate our listeners on what that means, what that new law means, and how that can apply to use of force in policing.
Right. So back in 2001, some of your listeners may remember that Senator West introduced the bill, which we call Senate Bill 1074, which was the Texas racial profiling law. And it required for law enforcement in the state of Texas to actually submit data, every year related to who they stopped and who they searched and who they ended up arresting, right? So it was kind of a breakdown according to race and ethnicity of individuals that came in contact with the police. Well, recently, because of the Sandra Bland incident that took place a few years ago, the legislators introduced in the last legislative session what became known as the Sandra Bland Act. And most of the act relates to mental capacity and mental illness, specifically for jailers in the state of Texas to be able to identify when someone that is committed to a jail exhibits signs of mental illness. But it also relates to law enforcement insofar as that now police officers are going to have to report a great deal more data than they ever did, since the onset of that racial profiling law in 2001.
And so that is something, is that a national act now, a national law?
No, it's a Texas law.
Okay.
But we are one of many states that have laws such as those. It's just that Sandra Bland, because it took place in Texas, the Texas legislators were the ones that actually took it on in the last legislative session.
And so when they report, they basically then a physical report that they have to do as it pertains to each situation now.
Exactly. So imagine for some of your audience that may have had a statistics course in college, I'll give them a little taste of what it was like to sit on that front row, nervous in front of a professor by saying the following. Imagine going between, in the past we used to only report one table. Now we're going to be reporting about 12 tables worth of data annually on behalf of each agency in the state.
Okay. And, it's interesting because of the media and everything that's been going on. What is your take? We had this situation, and I can't remember the city, the gentleman that was a security guard recently in the last couple of days that was helping at a restaurant or a bar, and he had contained the suspect who was attempting to rob, and basically the police shot him. And because, there's so much people on social media has created this cyber courage where people can say these things without knowing the facts. And, I have several friends that are police officers, and there's good cops, there's bad cops, just like there's good people and bad people in this world. It's not always, the cop's fault, but, it's just the media is over sensationalizing so many of these cases that some of them are due process and should be profiled in the media and should be brought to light. But what are you finding just from the psyche of police officers? Because I know then talking to my friend Herb that, it's really taking a toll on them psychologically what is happening in the media, and that people automatically judge them as being bad before they're even doing anything.
Absolutely. And so, I've often said it publicly and privately when asked a similar question, and that is, according to the FBI, there are 1 million police officers in the streets today. Out of the 1 million police officers in the streets in the United States today, the majority of them are honest, decent, hardworking people that get up in the morning to just do a good job and protect the rest of us in society. There is absolutely no question about that. And sadly, the media has emphasized the few isolated cases that we see from time to time when there are individuals in the police force that should have never been police officers, right? So they either abuse the authority that they've been given, they ignore the Constitution of the United States, or quite simply, they're racist. And so at the end of the day, the handful of those that make everyone else look bad really have taken a toll in moralizing the young officers graduating from the academy today and trying to do a good job.
And what are departments doing to try to help them with that morale?
Well, part of it is that I think, there are two components, right? So police departments as a whole, they try to emphasize the fact that the majority of the citizens in our community, and particularly here in Texas, are incredibly supportive of law enforcement, right? So when you saw that Dallas shooting some years back where the 5 officers lost their lives in El Centro, one of the things that happened across the state is people just went out. And I know because I was sitting down with police officers when you would have people walk up to them and pat them on the back or pay for their meal or enact some sort of a statue reminding people how wonderful they are. So I think that law enforcement seldom times hear from the rest of us that are supportive, that pray for them, that think of them in a positive way. And they sometimes sadly hear from the group of individuals that are often loud and critical of them, and that does affect their nerves. So I think law enforcement is trying to remind the young recruits that the majority of citizens that they serve are in fact supportive of law enforcement.
Yeah, I think that's important because I think it's so important to restate what you said, that the large majority are supportive. That it's the, and not to say just like, in using my friend her, but, there's been cases, Ferguson cases, around the country, Trayvon Martin and so forth, where he's totally taken the side, of the victim, and others saying, that particular police officer didn't act appropriately. But then there's other times when it instantly the blame goes to the police officer automatically, and that's not always fair either. So I feel like it's important for us in the media to reinforce that, understand both sides of the story before you make judgments. But that's not always what social media is about anymore, sadly.
Exactly, and I think that a lot of reporters unfortunately sell the bad news first, and they are oftentimes clinging on to the drama, to the shooting, to the video, to the audio. That puts a lot of good officers in a bad limelight because of a handful of people that are simply should have never been police officers.
And speaking of use of force in policing, a great question is, how do we train? How do you, your expertise, train the officers on use of force as it pertains to community engagement?
Right. So use of force is probably one of the most sensitive areas in policing you'll find today. Right. So for starters, you will find individuals that, we have to teach our officers to engage in what we call verbal judo, which is the idea that they will use their words in a forceful manner to try to disarm the individual. Not physically disarm the person, but disarm the person from a stance of perhaps engaging in a more significant use of force. Then we go into various techniques, and then ultimately the last resort for police officers is to use a gun in an incident, right? So we try to tell our officers that unless it is absolutely necessary, they are not to engage in pulling out their gun and shooting at someone unless their lives or the lives of others are simply in danger. The problem with use of force a lot, Kim, is that when you watch something on TV or you listen to something on the radio, oftentimes people are quick to jump at what they think they saw or they heard, and oftentimes that video does not capture the essence or the context of what happened. And so we, sometimes people say, "Oh, look, he's shooting at him," but they don't understand that maybe the suspect had a gun or that there was somebody else
right.
that was at risk at the time. So I think that it's really important not only for police officers to receive the right training, and I have trained police officers on use of force. In fact, I do that often, but also for the community members to also have a realistic expectation as to exactly what it is. Now, sometimes the video does tell the full story, and sometimes that full story is horrible, and we have to act upon it and fire that officer
right.
and prosecute that officer accordingly. But oftentimes we see that the video doesn't tell the whole story, and the true predicament, Kim, is that police departments cannot release the entire video oftentimes because it is being investigated by the DA and by Internal Affairs.
Yeah, and before we go to break, I think that's so critical because we are an on-demand society that want answers like yesterday, and it is so frustrating as a member of the media when I know they have to do their jobs when they're asking, for example, the Thousand Oaks shooting, and they're asking these questions that it just happened. They haven't even started their investigation yet. You have to give them time to give proper information. So it's so critical to just wait. Don't believe. There's a lot of fake news on social media. We know that. So I just encourage people to get educated before you give an opinion, and because we rush to judgment too quickly in our society, and it's not a good thing, So when we come back, I want to talk to you more about community engagement and something you said about it's not always guns. I know there's like pens now that somebody could have a writing pen that actually is a gun. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, how we can be more vigilant in our community. And if you're just tuning in, we're on air with Dr. Alex Del Carmen, and we'll be right back talking more about racial profiling and how we can get more engaged and help support our police officers.
Experts in Business, 620 AM, KEXB. KEXB.
Welcome back to In the Know with Brian Glenn. This is Kim Francis guest hosting today, and I'm so happy to have Dr. Alex Del Carmen on the show. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad to have you. And basically, I just am so impressed with your background. You are a national expert on criminology, criminal justice, and strategic studies, the professor and executive director at Tarleton State of these roles, and you oversee their criminal justice program, the graduate program for public admin, and the Corps of Cadets, as well as 5 academic institutes. So we are talking about racial profiling. We're talking about how we can support our law enforcement, get their morale up from a lot of different cases in the media that are sensationalized, and not to say that some of them should not be nationally known. They should, but I just am a big proponent on let's learn the facts and before we rush to judgment. Dr. Del Carmen, there is a caller, Steve from Allen, called in on the break and has a question for you.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to know what we as white Americans can do, non-police officers, to decrease the social profiling, the racial profiling of our community.
Okay.
So the question is, Dr. Del Carmen, Steve wants to know is what in the Caucasian community, non-police officers, what can they do to help kind of tone down the social and racial profiling in the community?
Right. So I've often said that racial profiling in policing comes from the social dynamics that we've had in this country for over 200 years as it relates to minorities, right? So it's not a law enforcement problem that was created by law enforcement, and unfortunately, it's not a problem that will be resolved by law enforcement. Now, law enforcement can do a lot to obviously, legitimize their role, to observe the Constitution and follow it, but it is a community problem. And so your caller is right in the sense that the community-based problem that racial profiling poses to law enforcement is based on the community. And I think what all Americans, not only Caucasian Americans, but what all Americans can do to address racism is obviously to bridge that gap, right? To basically treat everyone equally, as President Kennedy once said, to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, to, obviously go above and beyond the simple, nature that some people have to look at those differences, but rather step above it. And at the end of the day, I think Texas can serve as an example for the rest of the country because first and foremost, we are Texans, right? So we look at each other, with that dignity and respect that we give one another and respect each other's properties and respect each other for who we are. So I would argue that it is a community exercise, a community engagement before it becomes a law enforcement component.
Steve, did that answer your question, my friend?
Yes, ma'am, it does. I thank you for your response. I travel a lot, and I see a lot of racial profiling up and down the highways, and it disturbs me. It really does. And I thank you for your response, sir.
Thank you so much for listening and for calling in. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And, Dr. Del Carmen, there's something that Steve brought up in that question that I would like to ask you because, I've seen, again, in talking to a few of my officer friends, but when you see, I feel like, I was raised by my mother that it didn't matter who it was. If it was a school teacher, if it was a police officer, if it was a fireman, anyone that was an elder to me or in a position of authority, if they asked me to sit down, I sit down. If they asked me to stand up, I stood up. If they told me to put my hands where they could see them, that's what you do. And there seems to be a systemic lack of respect for authority in our country. And I remember a video a couple years ago in McKinney, Texas, of a police officer who was called to a pool party, and someone caught on video him continually asking a woman, and she did happen to be African American, but I don't necessarily see color, but she was African American at that point, and this is where this incensed on social media, to please sit down. And she kept getting in his face and getting in his face and getting in his face. Well, let me tell you, knowing police officers and my mom working with them, you don't know when they put one hand what they're going for. I mean, there's little spy things you can buy online, a pen that can be a gun or a knife. I was blown away at how many times he asked her to sit down and how many times she wouldn't do it. And that really bothers me. And maybe it's just my age because I'm not in that demographic, but I was raised better than that.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something that happened, has happened across the board for our entire society. It's not only an American problem, but it's an international problem. I travel the world and I travel often, and I see it all the time too, where people have just, they're losing that common decency with one another. To get up when an elder is standing in a bus and give them your seat. To be courteous, to open the door for someone that's coming in with packages.
Right.
And in your example that you're citing, to obey the law, right? So it's the police officer standing in front of you and telling you to do something, to simply follow the rule of law. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, and by the way, just I'll say this before answering that question, Kim, by saying that every generation says that about the previous generation, right?
Sure.
Sure. If you heard your mom talk in church, you say the same about, you and me as being from the same generation, that, boy, we just never listened, and we did this and we did that.
Right.
We didn't turn out so badly after all. But right. I do think that we're onto something here as it relates to the fact that there is that loss of common decency, that I think some people, everything is relative. There's no right or wrong. Everything is admissible. It's the practice of, you ask for forgiveness before asking for permission.
Right.
And I think when you look at someone in uniform, you challenge them, because why? You have a telephone that you can record it and download it on Facebook. And some of your listeners, they may be surprised when I tell them this, but Texas is what we call a one-party consent state. And what that means is that in the state of Texas, you do not need permission.
You're absolutely
to pull
right.
out a cell phone and record.
You're right.
So by virtue of that alone, that sort of inspires people to do that and be the next Facebook, rock star, by being able to post how you define a police officer. So some of it is also attention seeking.
No, absolutely, you're right. And I think to what Steve's, his point was is that I remember, I think it was 60 Minutes and 2020, they go undercover, and you would put an African American or Indian or a Hispanic citizen to hail a cab, and then you would have a Caucasian hailing a cab. And it really was quite sad to see the racial profiling that occurs. And to your point, it's gone on for generations, and sadly, it'll probably continue going on for generations. But I just hope that there's enough of us, that you said earlier, that there's enough of us that are good, that we can continue having these dialogues and continue to do the right thing, so that those that are not doing what's right, don't eventually take over the majority.
That's right, and I think we are a great country too, and I'm always an optimist when it comes to that, right? So because I am a first-generation immigrant from Nicaragua, I came to the United States legally when we were 14 years of age, and I tell you, looking at the alternatives, our country is the greatest country in the planet, and we'll continue to do that, and by virtue of that, I think it gives us a hope and a sense that wonderful document that our founding fathers created, that we call the Constitution, it means something, right? It has meaning and it has a purpose that after 200 and plus years, it still matters more today perhaps than it ever did.
No, absolutely. Before we go to the break, though, I want to come back and talk a little bit about your book, because I want to let people know, how can people find you on social media or learn more about you and the incredible work that you're doing to help train our officers and really policing kind of our criminal justice system, because it's so important. I just want to say thank you for this is a work of service that you're doing as well.
I often tell people, Kim, that at the end of my life, I want people to say, he served those that serve, because at the end of the day, that's what I try to do. But I will tell you that they can find me on social media, either obviously Google my name, and the other option is to go to the www.tarleton.edu, and then go under criminal justice, and you will find us there, and my email address is there, and my information as well. So, I'm incredibly blessed to really be among the very best of the best, to work with people that are just amazing individuals. So deeply humbled by that.
Well, we appreciate you, and want to say thank you so much. We're going to come right back with Dr. Alex Del Carmen, and we're going to talk about, is the community informed? How can we be more informed and be more engaged in this, so that questions like Steve, what can we do to help, I think is a great segment for us. So we'll be right back with Dr. Alex Del Carmen.
Your experts in business throughout North Texas. 620 AM, KEXB.
Welcome back to In the Know with Brian Glenn. This is Kim Francis filling in today as Brian is in Orange County test driving the brand new Jaguar SUV. Go to his Instagram and follow and check it out. It is gorgeous, of course. We are here in studio with Dr. Alex Del Carmen. Welcome back to the show, sir. And again, thank you for all of the amazing insight that we're getting into racial profiling and how we can be a part of the discussion when it comes to helping to support our men and women in blue.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
You know, one of the things when we were preparing for the show, and I think it's important, we've touched on it here today, is the community essential, and are they informed? How would you answer that question today, and how can we do better as a community?
So I would answer the question by saying that the community is absolutely essential for us not only to keep peace, but for law enforcement to be able to do their job properly. And unfortunately, I don't think the community is as informed as we should be. And part of the reason is because we are so busy. We rely largely on social media to inform us. And social media seldom provides context and provides depth as to what really happens, right? They just provide a 30-second snippet that you're going to read and basically formulate an opinion one way or the other. But really, you know, quite honestly, I think all of us want to know more. It's just that we just seldom have the time and sometimes the interest to be able to get involved and volunteer and get to really understand what's at the core of a lot of these national issues.
I think that's a great point. I want to let you know we have another caller on the line. Ben, who is it again, please? Dave from Stephenville, thank you so much for calling. What is your question for Dr. Del Carmen?
Yeah, Dr. Del Carmen, I'm a graduate of Tarleton State University, been a admirer of yours for a long time. Just wanted to ask you, do you know what the statistics are for just the pullover rate for minorities versus people who are not minorities in this country, or in more specific, the state of Texas?
Right. So it's great to be able to talk to you. One of the things, that's a great question too. One of the things that we look at is we don't only just look at who gets pulled over, but we also look at what happens once the individual gets pulled over, right? So oftentimes, you know, people make the mistake that they look at, you know, a city's population, and then they compare that to the population of people that get pulled over by a police officer or by a police department. And I think that's like comparing apples and oranges. And the reason for that is you take, for instance, the city of Arlington, which is, you know, surrounded by the ballpark, by the football stadium, and also is affected by Six Flags that brings millions of people to the city on an ongoing basis. And so how can we compare who police officers interact with, say, what the U.S. Census may say as to who lives in the city? And currently our census is 8 years old, right? So at the end of the day, that's not a statistically sound comparison. So what we look for is for instance, statistics related to who gets searched, whether or not the search produces contraband, and whether or not the contraband leads that person to be arrested. So what is more significant is what happens after the stop is made versus who actually gets stopped. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Dave,
like I said, I've been a big.
Go ahead.
I've been a big fan of yours for a long time, Dr. Del Carmen. Graduated from Tarleton State University, and thanks for being on the air tonight.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Thank you so much for calling in. We appreciate you listening and for your question. And I think that is a great question. When we have a few minutes left before we wrap the show, Dr. Del Carmen, what are some things that you would like to leave with our listeners in terms of, thoughts to think about, resources to study or to get more engaged, I'd love to just kind of open it up to you and give you kind of a freestyle of what we can learn from you in this last part of our show.
So thank you once again, Kim, for inviting me. This has been a true honor for me to be part of your show, and I heard wonderful things about you, and I look forward to our next interview. One of the things that I will tell you, though, is from my perspective, as it relates to the future and where we are in policing today, the broader issue is really, really important, which is that law enforcement, they have a very difficult job to do. This is probably, and has been said by many of us, that it is the hardest job in the planet because police officers are oftentimes invited to go to neighborhoods and only to resolve an issue. And as soon as that issue is resolved, they're begged and asked to leave because somehow the property value of that neighborhood will diminish by the presence of a police car. These are individuals that get out in the rain, get out in the snow, get out when it's 110 degrees out there, wearing a bulletproof vest to try to protect the lives of the rest of us. And I think we just need to really have a national and a state dialogue as to what exactly is the role and should be the role of law enforcement, and have realistic expectations for what these men and women in uniform can do for the rest of us. Through my lenses, law enforcement are heroes. They do a great job, and they're seldom times represented fairly in the media. And I think we need to also do a better job within law enforcement to be able that we screen out, individuals that should never be part of that law enforcement community. I'm currently developing a mechanism that will allow us to weed out people and be able to allow us to know who is and who is not going to be a good police officer during the infancy stage of that recruit coming into the police academy. So
I'm so glad you said that, because I had someone a couple weeks ago, we were having this conversation about someone that came out, and I think he had been on the force for maybe 6 months, and the gentleman that he had attended to at this restaurant was a former police officer, and he was like, I don't know how this person with that agitation and everything, the state he was in, he was like, how he got that far. So I think that is so important, what you just said.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think, we need to have a realistic attitude, but we also need to be informed. Volunteer to go on a ride-along with a police officer on an evening shift. Get to know your local police officer so that you can fully understand the dimensions of their job. And I think many of us are going to be surprised that the information that has been disseminated via a lot of these television shows and a lot of these documentaries is simply false. It exaggerates the work. It completely undermines and undercuts the risk that they take, and it seldom times shows the amount of pressure and the difficulties that they have to deal with in their daily lives. So I think we have to try to understand them in order to be able to better our police force and better our community.
Well, I want to say thank you so much. It has been such an honor to have you on the show. And how do people get your book, Racial Profiling in America?
They can certainly look for it on Amazon, but I am writing the sequel of that book, which should be published in the spring, and we are looking forward to disseminating that on Amazon as well.
Well, we're going to have you back on. I'm going to let Brian know that the next time I guest host, this is such an important subject, and I think that everything that you said was just so spot on. And definitely make sure that people pay attention, be more aware of your surroundings. And Dr. Del Carmen, thank you so much. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and I look forward to talking to you very soon, sir.
And you as well. Thanks again, Kim. Bye-bye.